DevOps for the database. So I gave this talk, or a longer version of this talk, at a conference previously, and then I was invited to give it here. This is going to be a little bit nutrient dense. I'm going to go through it a little bit faster. There are lots and lots of references and links in the slides, and the slides are online, so that's just like preamble stuff. So let's start off with a couple of DevOps stories. And my slides have, okay, there we go. Generally, just to orient you, this talk is about what I've learned from working with a lot of folks over the last 10 years or so, specifically on the database side. That's where my background is. And seeing folks become very fluent with operating their databases with and without DBAs, and seeing some other folks kind of struggle with that, especially as things move really fast and sometimes break. So there's a large marketing firm that's a customer of ours, and their story is that they had one DBA who was handling all of the operational responsibilities of the database for a very large engineering team. And things were growing super fast. In fact, the company was growing super fast, so fast that her role actually shifted out of being a DBA into hiring a team of DBAs. We saw a lot of interesting dynamics in who was using, who was working with the database and who was focusing solely on code, and whether things were more operationally focused or more DevOps focused. And this story didn't actually end all that happily, because I feel like in this case, the company ended up kind of building a wall around the database, or hardening the wall around the database and saying the only people allowed inside of that wall, the only people allowed to touch the database and do things like schema changes and so forth, were the DBAs. And the developers, because of that, were kind of encouraged to not get very involved with the database. And there were some 400 developers or something like that. They went from like 50 developers to 400 developers in a couple of years. And as they grew, it felt like the gulf between them just widened, right? Another story is a really fast-growing benefits administration company from a few years ago in Silicon Valley. They approached us at a similar sort of juncture in their growth. There was one DBA, and there were about 20 developers at the time that they started taking a look at us. And I was on some calls with this person who was a personal friend of mine. And he said, you know, since we started talking, we're actually up to 50 developers now, and our goal is to hit 100 developers next month. It was like insane growth. It's one of the fastest growth stories I've ever seen. And I said, well, how are you coping with this? Because you're still the only DBA. And he goes, wow, it's miserable. You know, the culture here is that you have to come in and prove your worth by shipping something to production on the first day. And that means that I have a bunch of people who don't know our app shipping it to production on their first day, which is happening on 4 or 5 people on a daily basis. It feels like are shipping something new to production, and it's constantly broken. And what he was pointing out to me, and I kind of reflected back to him, was that he was supposed to have authority, he was supposed to have responsibility for the database, but he had no authority over the database because the developers were pushing code that was changing things in the database, and he was somehow supposed to, pick up the pieces. I said, well, what's your plan? And he said, well, I've instituted a policy that I have to review every schema change and everything that changes a query before it goes to production. I'm preventing things from getting shipped to production until I get a chance to review the database impact of that. And I said, I don't think this is going to work. This is going to go dark, dark places for you. And we were able to put together a little bit of a plan. I helped him, just sort of, I don't know, I guess I'd call myself a little bit of a thought partner for him, or just reflecting back some of what he was telling me, and helped him put together a pitch to both change some of the processes as well as to advocate for more resources. Because DevOps doesn't mean that you can starve people for resources, right? So that one ended up being a very happy story. And the last one is one of our first customers, who's a media startup, a media company that you've all heard of. And they run with a very lean staff. They punch far above their weight compared to the industry norms. And there were 2 operations people when they approached us. And I thought, great, we're going to have a couple of our first customers, right? A couple of our first users. And what surprised me was that after they deployed, we saw they almost didn't use the software. Instead, a bunch of people overseas started using the software. And I said, who are these folks? And they said, well, those are the software developers. I mean, we didn't buy you because we wanted to be DBAs looking at, monitoring the database. We bought you because we wanted the developers to be able to look at the database. And that was our first, what we call golden motion. Golden motion is kind of a term of art for when you're feeling like product market fit is starting to happen, and you see one customer go through something, and then you're like, I want all of my customers to do that. And so that's the golden motion that we've kind of tried to repeat. Now, this is absolutely not a product pitch, and I feel like I've talked more about our relationship with our customers as a vendor than I intended to. But my point is that from my perspective, seeing people sort of coming up against the walls of the silo, and some of them taking down the silo, and some of them just like bouncing off and maybe building the silo thicker, there's a variety of patterns that I've seen. And now I've seen this happen dozens, many times. And not only in our customer base, but I've had a lot of conversations. I've reached out to folks all throughout industry and said, hey, this is what I think I see happening around the database. And can we talk about this? We get on a call or a video conference and talk about it a little bit. And it just feels like, I have no research to back this up, although there are other folks who have done plenty of research around this. This is anecdotal for me. So the question is, how can we kind of make database the last holdout of DevOps? How can we bring database into the DevOps processes and cultures and keep it from being that last little thing that you DevOps everything else, but the database is too hard? So that's what this talk is about. And I'll blow through a whole bunch of stuff. And then at the end, I've got some slides that are 3 concrete action steps that I've added in there more recently. And I'm actually in the process of writing a little mini book about this. And shameless pitch, if you have a blog post, or if you know somebody who has any of these experiences, please get in touch with me, because I would love to pick their brain and input that into this little mini book that I'm writing. Okay. So when you DevOps the database, I'm going to just use DevOps as a verb there, you get the same benefits as everywhere else. So you get, faster, better, cheaper, all 3, rather than faster, better, cheaper, pick 2, right? You get stability that leads to speed, that makes it possible to iterate faster and get more stability. And I mentioned the research, the 2018 State of DevOps report, the book Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren et al. There's a lot of really solid research in there, and I encourage you to check those out. All of those things are in the show notes at the end of these slides. But if you don't have these things, then you essentially get the reverse. No surprises. All of these things suffer. Things get slower, more brittle. People become single points of failure. There's process bottlenecks and choke points and things like that. And ultimately, you move slower, but you also get increased defect rates, failed deploys, things like that. So what is required for applying the principles and practices of DevOps to the database? In my opinion, this is a long list. These are some of the most important things. I won't read the slides to you. This is kind of an exhaustive list of all of the folks that I've talked to and everything that I've witnessed put together. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to do all of these things. There's a couple of things that I think are much more of a higher priority, that are easier to do and produce a bigger return on investment, and I'll mention a few of those things later. Those come at the top of this list, developers owning the database schema, developers owning database performance, and schema and data model as code. Those are the things that I think are the most important. Here's a little bit of an anecdote, sorry, not an anecdote, but a pull quote from the State of DevOps report, and I've put the bold in there myself, integrating database work into the software delivery process. So there's a bunch of places where you can see lots of people reinforcing in one way or another from many different angles that these kinds of principles seem to be true wherever people have found success. They kind of say the same thing over and over and over again. So how do we bring database to the DevOps? I break it down into 4 core things, and this is not, this is sort of my original, just the patterns that emerged to me. I think you got to focus on these 4 core elements, and I'll zip through a few slides here real quick. Deploy and release tooling. Now, this is not database deploy and release tooling. This is application and infrastructure deploy and release tooling. It needs to be automated. The database needs to be added into that rather than separate than that, right? So if you've got Jenkins or whatever, you got to bring the database stuff into that too, rather than doing it separately, especially rather than doing it manually. Observability is really important because that's what enables developers to actually understand and have a feedback loop into how their code is impacting how their application code is impacting the database performance. Without that observability, I think that is one of the things that kind of keeps the DBA sort of wedged into the position of, I'm the only one who can. And if you give developers observability into the database performance, then that really democratizes things. So I think that's really important. Shared knowledge and processes. This is a screenshot from Etsy's Deployinator. Notice that on the bottom, they've got the big green deploy to prod button right in the middle. On the bottom, they've got links to runbooks, wiki pages, dashboards, things like that. That's huge. I've got a bunch more material on that throughout the slides. The team structure is really important. This one is a little bit tricky because it's kind of a chicken and egg sort of a situation. The team structure kind of follows from the processes, but the processes also follow from the team structure. So this is not something where you just come in and do a big lift and replace or DevOps transformation or something like that. This is something that you need to actually approach in an agile way by trying one little thing, seeing if that works, touting the successes that you have, learning from the things that don't work, and then keep going in lots of small changes. And ultimately, I've seen people morph their team structures and their processes into something that works better for them. On the process side, the most important thing is don't screw it up. Don't cause an outage. If you go, hey, I want us to start doing DevOps for the database, and then you promptly take the database down. By the way, I've been there. What you do is you erode trust, and you spend some of your capital. And eventually, if you do that too many times, you don't get more chances to do it. Having a plan that you can use to show, look, I'm not just doing this by the seat of my pants. This is the plan that I intend to follow. This is the outcomes that I think will happen, and is it okay if I go ahead and do this? Is really important for advocating up the chain of command. I think it's super important to pick one place to start. Start with something small, one team, one app, one product, whatever. Start with something new rather than breaking something that's not broken. Start with something new and say, for this new thing, let's try something a little bit different and see what we learn from it. And if it works for the new thing, then you can backfill it into other things. That's really helpful. And then the final thing on culture is that you can't really change culture directly. Rin Daniels has a great article in a D-Zone guide that I was just looking at recently, talking about how I forget what the phrase they used was, control surfaces, anybody know? There was a really elegant phrase in there about what are the things that you can operate on that culture flows from. I've linked that later. Having leadership buy-in is great. It really helps. It is not necessary. You can do this on a grassroots basis, but it's tougher because you're kind of lifting uphill. But whoever is involved with this, I haven't seen it work very well where there's one person who's trying and there's other people who are like, whatever, the status quo works fine for me. So, building some sense of we're in it together, and collaboration. Even if one person is doing most of the work, they need to have at least emotional support and curiosity from the rest of the team. So if you're the person who's advocating for this really passionately, I think if you're advocating really passionately and other people are like whatever, ignoring you, maybe think a little bit more before you start acting, because this is one of those things that could be like a career risk if it doesn't go well for you. You do need people who deeply understand the database. You cannot just, throw up an RDS and throw out a whole bunch of database code and things like that. You need people somewhere. You need somebody who is that, that subject matter expert. It doesn't need to be somebody who knows everything about the database, but it needs to be somebody like, I'll just point out myself early in my career. I was curious about the database. There were people who knew a heck of a lot about it, and I was writing queries, and I was like, why doesn't this work? And they're like, that's because you need a having clause instead of a where clause. And I'm like, oh, mind blown, having clause. Never heard of it before. So you need people who are like curious like me, and you also need people who are like the people who are like, hey, you need a having clause. It's really tough, if you don't have that opportunity to grow and transmit that knowledge. So some things that have not worked in my personal experience. One is throwing a bunch of tools at the problem, and especially kind of throwing the tools at the problem really fast. And if the tools do not deeply understand the database or were built for someone else's environment, and are very specific to how their infrastructure runs or whatever, those kinds of things can very quickly cause an outage. And that's how you punch a hole below the waterline, and the DevOps transformation process gets sunk. There are lots and lots of ways that culture can work against. I've seen a lot of this. One thing I'll caution is that you cannot buy DevOps in a vendor like Vivid Cortex. I've seen folks go, we really do not have a DevOps culture here. People don't care about database performance. I really want them to, my life is miserable. Quick anecdote. I could tell a long story about the sale that somebody thought was really sure, that this company was going to buy, because the database administrator was super miserable and was up all night. And the reason that the company didn't purchase was because nobody cared that the database administrator was up all night. Right? No one else cared. It's like, so what? Lots and lots of people have to care in order for a company to be motivated to make a decision. The legacy database administrator role transforming into more of a database reliability engineering role is something that Sylvia has written and spoken about eloquently in several places, several blog posts, several podcasts, several conference talks. I've got links throughout here and there. The legacy role is sort of this, like, I own the database and I keep away, you shall not pass. And she was, with the support of other people in her teams, was able to change that very successfully, so I always put her up as a success story. And if the leaders don't support you, like if you're the DBA that nobody cares is up all night and is miserable, then sorry, if your leaders are not going to be motivated, then it's probably not going to work. Something else that is much more under your control is how well you plan, and if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. One thing on this: trying to go fast, or if your company or org is trying to go fast, as opposed to trying to build resilience to enable speed, is a mistake that I've seen. Move fast and break things, suddenly everything is breaking. It doesn't have to be that way. I know, it really depends a lot on how people actually execute on move fast and break things. But I think if people just sort of have heard the phrase move fast and break things and then go do that, suddenly everything breaks, right? So that's not a good idea. So the hardest things that I have seen people struggle with, and some of this is going to be maybe a little bit of a restatement from a different angle, is politics. Selling DevOps to leadership, or selling DevOps to the DBA who doesn't really think that there's a need for the DBA role to evolve a little bit as technology and processes and culture evolve. Sometimes people are fine with the status quo, and that can be tough to overcome. The tooling is a big sore point in moving fast and flexibly and iterating and enabling self-service around the database. Schema changes are hard. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Databases also were never really designed to be treated like ants instead of things that you care about individually. Just at the technology level, the databases that we are using are, by and large, they came from an old school, one server, very artisanally taken care of kind of an environment. And so operationally, they were not really designed with the control planes and the configuration and all of these kinds of, there is no database that's like running at large scale in production that was designed with anything like a 12-factor methodology or anything like that in mind. So it makes it really hard to apply sort of infrastructure as code to the database unless you do it on the database's own terms and work around its idiosyncrasies and sharp edges. And there's not a lot of tooling that just like works everywhere. There isn't just a chef for the database or something like that. So that's something that everybody who's successful with this handcrafts at least to some extent. And there is not a lot of integration between the database schema and canaries and deploy tooling, feature flags, things like that. So everybody that does this successfully builds that into the application. They don't build it into the tooling, in my experience. They rarely build it into the tooling. So, you can look at companies like Netflix, and they've got Spinnaker and so forth and so on. Those are exceptions, not the rule. But the folks who are doing this, who don't have the scale and the resources of somebody like Netflix, but who are doing it successfully at smaller scale, are building it into the fabric of the application itself, not really the tooling around the application so much as the application code. That's what I've seen. The other thing is when, databases, again, these legacy databases were not really designed to be run at high scale, highly available, with high performance, in demanding conditions. So everybody who's doing that, every Facebook or Skype or whatever of the world has really worked around the limitations of their database to do that. And that's a set of constraints on their choices that also constrains how you can do some of these operational things. Schema changes, non-blocking schema changes at scale without any downtime is a really prominent example of that. So 3 things that you can do that I think are the first things that I would encourage everybody to just learn more about. I'm not telling you to do this. My suggestion is simply to read more, follow the links and learn more. First thing is to take a very iterative approach to trying to make some improvements around this. If you feel like the database is guarded by, somebody with a sword behind, in a walled garden, in a silo or whatever, and you want to change that, think of the first thing that you can do that'll make a small change for the better, and approach it in a sprint mentality. Set out a plan, do something lightweight, and say, I think if we can, change this one thing, then we might achieve that result. Try and get some buy-in, try and get that to happen, and then go, what worked, what didn't, what failures can we learn from, what successes can we amplify, right? So I've got a few links here that you can follow. The second thing is schema as code. So we all do, hopefully, infrastructure as code, at least to some extent. Schema needs to be in the code too. And this should not be like, you've got your application code and your Jenkins and your deploy pipelines and all of these kinds of things over here. And then you've got a separate thing over here with a separate set of deploy tooling for automation, as in, you Slack the DBA and say, hey, can you go and execute, schema change script number 1, 2, 3 across all of our production shards? That's like a separate route to production through a separate set of people and expertise for the schema. You want that to be part of the application so that the application actually looks at the database and goes, there's a schema version table and it's got version 3 and I am built to expect version 5. So this database needs to be upgraded. Now this probably sounds stupid and scary as hell as I stand here on stage saying it. But if you follow through the links that are in the previous and the next slide, you'll see that there's a lot of people who have written about doing exactly this. And the benefit of this is that now these schema changes are done. Let's say that you have kind of a development workflow where people are developing on their laptop and then they deploy to a staging environment or a testing environment, and then they deploy to staging, and then they deploy to production with one canary, and then they deploy to everybody to production. Or some lesser evolved version of that. Whatever your process is, if the schema is part of the code, and if the schema migrations are part of the code, and if the app itself handles them rather than some tool like migration tool or whatever, then you iterate on it and you rehearse it many, many times before you go to production. And you have a chance in production What this will do is it will force you to look at how you can make your production deploy process built around the reality that a schema migration in production has to be handled gracefully and account for the possibility of failure and back off and retry and redeploy without taking things down. Right? So if you do this, it's like test-driven development. You can't just go into a code base and then add tests to it later because all of your functions were written with side effects and all of these kinds of things. But if you do test-driven development up front, then all of your code is magically testable because it has to be, right? And if you have a legacy code base and you want to try and add tests to it, you end up doing a lot of refactoring to get that to work. The same thing will happen if you set this as a goal for yourself. You will start to refactor how you think about deploying, mutating, and operating your databases and weaving that into your application. So it's one of those things that's kind of a forcing function for sort of getting to where you want to be. And the last thing, which is actually kind of a prerequisite for a lot of this, is decoupling the application code and the schema as much as possible. That might sound really weird because I just said the schema should be in the code, but what I mean is that the application can tolerate different schema versions. I'll give you a concrete example. At VividCortex, we have time series tables with lots and lots of data that we want to never, ever change under any circumstances because it's just so big. And so what we do is we put a version number in each table name. And the application goes, oh, I'm reading some data from 3 years ago, and that was schema iteration number 2, and here's some code that can read that. And I'm writing some code, and that's writing some data, and that's writing to schema iteration number 5, and so here's some code that can do that. And eventually, we're going to roll off and purge and archive all of schema version 2, and we'll go in and clean up that code because it's never used anymore. And you can instrument around these things, like you can answer the question, is schema version number 2 code ever exercised anymore? Because you've got a metric of it, for example. So you can, there's again, a lot of writing about specific patterns to do this, and it's beyond just the database. If you follow the links through, for example, in Thomas Limoncelli's article, there's an expand contract pattern that's in Release It, for example. So lots of good reading there. All right, I want to wrap up and give a few minutes for the next speaker to come up on the stage and get the laptop set up. But just real quickly, one of the common questions that comes up a ton is, well, what about the DBA role? Like, if I've been a DBA for a long time, what is going to have to change about my role? And I'll encourage you again to read Sylvia Boutros' blog post, but essentially you need to think of yourself as more of an embedded resource, a subject matter expert, a consultant to the application delivery teams. That's what I've seen work really, really well in practice, is to stop being sort of the human automation of I will log in and run that command for you, and get yourself into the point where you are enabling and coaching and mentoring people to do it themselves as much as possible. And you will still have work to do. It's just that now you will be doing the stuff that is actually a strategic priority, like sitting in the architecture meetings and talking about how to architect this thing for scale, as opposed to the architecture meetings going ahead without you because you were firefighting and now you've got 2 problems to solve later when a badly architected product gets shipped. So this, if you scan this QR code, that's where the slides are, or you can just go to my website and go under the talks URL. I would love to hear from you. Again, I'm going to try and continue to collect feedback and ideas and existence proofs and blog posts and any kind of reference material that you can. I'm trying to put it all into a little mini book that I'm going to I'll go ahead and commit publicly, and is this being recorded? That I'm going to try and finish up within the next couple of weeks. So would love to hear from you. Grab me in the hallway. We have a table back here at the VividCortex booth. And may the database force be with you. And I will now get myself off of the stage. Thank you very much.